Hey everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is Ergo Josh, and today we're going to learn how to draw eyes. So if you want to use the references that I'm using today, I have them on a Pinterest board. You can find my Pinterest in maybe the link above or in the description, but I'll have this Pinterest board in case you want to follow along. Now we're going to use this one first because it's like the basic example, and I've already downloaded it and brought it into Procreate. So the first thing I want to talk about is the basic shapes that exist when you're drawing an eye. So when you're drawing an eye, a lot of people say, the almond shape, you can go into a lot of the anatomy and stuff, but I want to show you a basic approximation of the shape that you can use for almost any angle. So I'm going to quickly trace it over the main shape of the eye here so you can see it's this almond shape. And then I'm going to hide that, or actually I'm just going to decrease the opacity. I'm going to do another layer and show you the simplification of it. So when you're drawing an eye, you can simplify it to a few triangular shapes. So I'm drawing straight lines here, and you will see in a moment that there are a very specific number and they all mean a very specific thing. So I'm drawing two more here, and then the last one here. So if we hide the image and we show the tracing, you can see that it's almost exactly the same shape. However, it's a lot more simplified. So what does this mean? So if I go back into this layer and show you, I can draw some lines to show you where those triangles are. So here you can see there's 4 triangles that make up the eye. And so this main one, the first one over here, is just where you have that tear duct area, that kind of pink area you see here, and then a little bit more of the eye, just the dark corner that receives a lot of the shadow. You could go as far as to do that if you really wanted to, but that would be like a minor division. And then these 3 right here represent the round shape of the eye. So if I hide this again, this is going to be where the eye extends the most, and then these planes are going to kind of, if you were to average them, they would point that way, and then this one would point towards you, and this plane would be where the pupil is, and that's where we see, oh, I drew in the wrong place, but that's where you see the person looking at you. If this person was looking down a little bit more, it would be roughly the same spot. So why is this shape important? Well, let's try and draw it on a head that's at a different perspective and see if we can draw the same triangular shapes on it. So I did a rough sketch of a head at a different angle. It's a little bit off because I don't really have a reference for this. But if we wanted to draw this eye shape on a head that's we're looking down from the corner, what we would do is, if I can take the brush size down a little bit, is we would just use the same exact shape. So we're going to draw the first edge that we did right here, right there. And then I'm going to draw the horizontal part at the top. And then where it comes down for the other corner of the eye here. And then I would do the same for these 3 sides at the bottom. Now this part is going to go in much faster because the head is really tucked in, the eye socket is really tucked in at that point. And then this second edge, actually I'm going to go ahead and number them right here so that's really easy for you guys to see. 6. All right. So there's 6 sides, 2, 3, this is 4, and so that part goes in, and then 5 and 6 are going to come outward again, like that, like so. And this eye can be a little bit tucked in a little bit more. Let me go ahead and move that before we go forward. And then I'm going to go ahead and number the last 2 edges. And so now you can see it's those same edges, but it's in a different perspective. So what I can do here is I can draw the same lines to break it up. And if you look closely, you can, most of you should be able to start being able to visualize how this eye would look. I don't, depending on your skill level, maybe you can draw heads easily in different angles, or maybe it's still a challenging thing for you, but this should be helpful because it allows you to see that the eye can be broken up into very simple edges, and those edges can be used to help you draw them in different angles. So this is the same scenario here. This is the main part of the eye where the iris would be, and it would house the pupil, and so that would be the same thing here. The iris would most likely be here, and this person would be most likely looking upwards at us. Now, this can change because of the way your eye is shaped. The eye is not a perfect circle like this. The eye is actually more like this. So it'll be a circle for the most part, but it will also have this part bulging out. And then your pupil will be somewhere around here. I don't really know the science part of it. I'm sure there's plenty of videos telling you the details on that, but I want to point out to you that this part of the eye bulges out, and that's where all of the lenses are and everything that helps you be able to see properly. And if they don't work, then you need glasses like me. So when the bottom edge of the eyelid right here, this is not accurate at all, but I'm just going to draw it here so that you guys can see, is here, and the person's is looking directly across, this can actually push the eyelid out a little bit more. So depending on where the person is looking, this point can kind of change just a little bit. So if the person was looking over there, the eye might shift to be like that. And if the person was looking back this way, this angle might look more like that. And then the eyeball would be, the pupil and the iris would be over here. And that's just something to keep in mind. You don't need to make such drastic changes like I have, especially if you're drawing something very realistic, which I don't know if I mentioned already. This is a more semi-realism approach to drawing eyes, which is my main style. But yeah, that is going to be super helpful in case you are wondering on how to draw eyes at a different angle, and if they trip you up, you can always remember those different planes. They will always be on every single human eye that you want to draw. You don't really have to worry about missing out when you're breaking it down into these simple shapes. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and show you how to actually use this to draw an eye. So let's go ahead and bring this example back up, and I'm going to draw a little bit of a stylized version of it. I'm going to use black just so that most of you can be able to easily follow along with what I'm doing. And I'm going to start out with drawing those basic shapes just like we did before. Now, I'm not going for an exact replication of this image, although it looks like I'm perfectly set up to do that. What I'm doing is trying to draw an eye that's not only somewhat realistic, but has some sort of appeal to it. So the great thing about semi-realism is you can make things very specific and kind of direct your own painting, if you will. It's like a little film. So what I'm doing here is, after I've drawn that shape in, I want to give some space for those eyelids. So if you see there, this surface here actually exists on top of kind of this eyelid here. So that's something that a lot of people don't really notice. It took me years to notice this, but there's a surface here, and then the skin kind of folds down. So I'm going to draw that in here. And it exists here as well, but you notice it kind of folds back. So this is a straight line, but that kind of begins to show you the surface there. So it kind of curves around. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to hide it at a certain point, like that. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw that little area. There's a science name for it, but I don't know what it is. It's way too big for my taste. Draw it like that. Do that. And then I'm going to go ahead and smooth out to those edges. I don't really need them anymore. Going to soften up my brush. And then what I'm going to do is another really important part. You see there's this fold here. So the top eyelid is made so that it can fold over your entire eye. And when it's up, the portion of the skin that's not in use kind of tucks under the skin that's right underneath your eyebrow. So that's why that line is there. That can vary depending on the race and ethnicity of the person that you're drawing. And I'm going to do a couple examples today, and hopefully those are good enough examples to show you the differences and what I mean. So after drawing that eye, one thing that I like to do for my own style is I like to make different parts of that line thicker to show that it's really deep, and then different parts lighter. So over here, this will be lighter, and then in here it'll be thick where most of the skin is, and then it will come back out lighter again. And so now, the most important part, we have the iris. So you want to keep in mind when you draw the shape of the eye, try and keep the placement of the iris as well in mind. I have a very shaky hand, especially since I don't have a screen protector right now, so forgive me for this imperfect circle. But when you're doing these kinds of paintings and sketches, especially in digital art, you don't need to worry about getting it perfect the first time. And then now we're going to do the pupil. The pupil should be about 1/3 the size of the iris. Don't let it get too big or too small unless you are going for a specific effect. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Shaping the eye up a little bit more here. It's a little bit long, so I want to curve that out a little bit more and erase some of those lines. If you're interested in what brushes I'm using, they will be in the card or the link in the description. I'm using brushes that I've made myself. I find they're a lot easier for me to work with in Procreate, and I can't wait to see what happens with Procreate 5. So I'm going to go ahead and shade this in. And now I'm going to sketch in lightly the shape of the eyebrow. So the eyebrow, you want to keep in mind, curves around the head. The head is pretty much flat at this end and it goes back. But this part of the face is curved slightly. So you want to keep that in mind when you draw the eyebrow. Don't just draw it like that. Think about how it's in this little nook here, comes up on top of the brow bone, and then comes back down right before it hits the cheekbone, but it doesn't go down that far. It kind of comes in, then it comes out, then it kind of tucks back in before the head becomes pretty much flat as it angles back towards the back of the head. So keeping that in mind, what I'm going to do is sketch that eyebrow out. Also, one thing that I do like to do is I like to do a little line where the lower eyelid kind of stops and it becomes the cheek. Now this is usually only present in people who are older, but it's always noticeable if you look really closely. This image doesn't have it because I'm pretty sure this has been photoshopped to hell, so but you still do see there are some faint lines there, so I like to keep that in the drawing. And again, I'm going to add a little bit of that line here where the skin still is transitioning. A lot of artists will add highlights here and really emphasize that corner, which you'll see again when I start doing my own stylized sketch. And now for the eyelashes. So for the bottom eyelashes, you can choose to keep them there, or you can choose to draw them in very, very, very lightly. I like to just be very specific with which ones are there. I don't like to go too much close to realism and having to painstakingly paint out each one of these or sketch out each one of these. But you can choose to leave them there, leave them out because no one really notices them, or just draw a few. As for the top eyelashes, there's something that really interesting happens when you draw eyes. And this is a very unique case where they intentionally took this photo so that you could see all of the eyelashes. But if I show you some eyes in Pinterest, you'll see that a lot of the times they're in shadow, either because of makeup or just because of the lighting. And if they're not in shadow and they're more realistic, there's only a few of them. So let me actually just go to my faces board and you can look at the eyes in those. So if we look here, you can see, if we just pick a few to zoom in on, let's see one that looks more natural. So if you see here, the eyelashes are pretty much just a blur and there's a few of them that show up. And so when you do drawings like that, you don't really want to try and draw a crazy amount of eyelashes. You see here, it's really not too much. There's a few that point out, but there's not too much detail on them. So for my sketch here, I'm going to do something more similar to those types of eyes. So I'm going to take my, let's use the basic brush here and draw in a little bit of a shadow. There's always going to be a little bit of a shadow also across the entire eye because of that upper eyelid. And it's, receding behind these folds of skin there. So there's always going to be a shadow there. And I'm going to start off there and then start adding some eyelashes. With drawing eyelashes, you really want to be as specific as you can with each one. If you're going to draw eyelashes like this, don't do them all the same shape, like all the same. That doesn't look too bad at first, but you'll notice the direction and where they're coming from is just completely random, and it makes it look very fake. And you don't want them all to look the same direction like that at all. You want to try to focus on making the lengths a little bit random, but they get longer as they come to the edge usually. And then you want to focus on grouping them as well. That is also another way to make your eyelashes look a lot more realistic. And make sure that they curve. Don't draw them like this. That doesn't look real. They come from beneath, right under this fold here, and then they come outwards. So, and then as they go around the eye, they angle towards that area. So like that. That one's a little bit too close. You want to kind of give them a good even spacing. Sometimes you can be irregular, but keep it natural. I'm not really going to take the time to do all of these eyelashes since this is just the demo sketch. Eyelashes are not my favorite part to draw because it's just tedious and I don't enjoy it, but that's how I found to keep them looking realistic. Now for the eyebrows, I'm not going to focus on them as much, but one thing that you need to keep in mind is that even if you draw a shape like this to bound them, a lot of times that they don't follow that, so you can draw some flyaway hairs here, and then usually you can get away with doing a diagonal sketch like this and then coming back with a different stroke direction from the back of the eye like that. So if I were to actually put some effort into it, I would do something like that and they would kind of mesh together. But again, a lot of the times when you're drawing people in a semi-realistic fashion, you're not going to see all of those eyebrow hairs. It's actually going to be a tone like that. And then you'll start to see some of the individual hairs here and there. But you can continue to blend that out and redraw the hairs and get it to look as realistic as it needs to before you're happy with it and you move on. Now I'm going to go ahead and draw some more stylized eyes, and I'm going to stop in between a couple of them to tell you more about the shading. So here I did it very quickly, but you can see again the main line, the horizontal line, and then the line this is line number 3. Then we have line number 4, 5, and 6. You can see here, since we're drawing it at an angle, there's a curve to this. So that's the shape of the actual eyeball. And you can see that the iris curves around that shape. It's not just a circle like this that ignores the surface of the eye, but it's actually on the surface. So you draw the circle like that and let it wrap around. One thing I like to do for shading is to draw these lines going across the upper eyelid. That adds a lot more interest and texture to the image and kind of gets you started shading without having to worry too much about what's the best way to start. I'm starting off by doing just a rough shadow for where the eyelashes are going to be. Now I'm using my soft skin brush to start shading the area above the eye. And so it's going to be darkest closer to the eye, and as you move upwards, it's going to get a lot brighter. And remember, this is the area right inside of the corner of the eye next to the nose, so it's going to be pretty dark there. I find the lower eyelid is also quite a bit darker most of the time than the cheek below, especially if the person you're drawing is wearing makeup. And one tip to drawing the inside of the eye, you want to make sure that you shade the entire thing and don't leave any area that's is white as the paper or canvas that you're drawing, you want it to be a full shade darker. That way your highlights and everything looks a lot more realistic. So I'm going to come in here and blend a lot of this, because what I want to do is keep the eye looking organic. And I like to suggest where the iris and the pupil are, not the iris, but the pupil location, and wait until later on to define it exactly. And I let the edge of the iris kind of bleed a little bit in this stage. I don't like to have too many sharp lines when I can avoid it. Now I'm blending the edge of the eye here because of course there's not really a line there. There's no lines anywhere usually, but especially not there. Try to blend that area so that it's much more faint, and you want the division that shows the surface of the lower eyelid to be more of a color change or a value change rather than a line. So I'm softening out a lot of the tones I put in. And what I'm going to do is refine a lot of the values here, especially softening out these areas that transition into the surface of the eye itself. Now what I'm going to do is use my pencil to darken up these corners here where it really is quite dark. Give this a little shade, and go ahead and use not a very sharp brush, it's a very thick one here. Kind of ghost in some of those eyelashes. You can see here, it's kind of confusing, but what the eyelashes are doing is they're coming from below the eyelid and then coming back up. So you want to think about that, but it's really just going to look like these straight lines, but make sure they're thicker at the bottom, like that. So that it suggests that, you know, when something comes in your vision, then curves around itself and then comes back up, it's going to be darker at that bottom portion. So draw those eyelashes darker at the bottom. It's a good tip to do actually, no matter what type of eyelashes you're doing, to draw them darker where they're connecting with the skin. So I did them really roughly there. I'm going to blend it out. Emphasize a few of them and keep this looking natural as possible. You can see why I don't like drawing eyelashes, because it takes so much effort to get them to look realistic, whereas they're really quite a small part of the eye. The main part is the surface that allows you to see. I'm going here again. What I want to do is create a clear gradation of where the concentration of darkness is. So it's right over here in this drawing. So what I'm going to do is do the same and just add more shadow here. I'm pressing lighter so that it's more of a shadow line that I'm drawing instead of a specific eyelash. I'm going to shape this eye a little bit more. I notice the shape of the pupil is too flat, so I'm going to make a light sketch of what I really want to do right here. You can see that looks much better, and so I'm going to actually take some of this color and just lightly sketch it over that. Do the same here, and I'm going to take this mixed brush and blend it. I like the mixed brush that I created because it allows me to keep a lot of the texture even though I'm blending something. The risk of blending things is it makes things super over smoothed, and that can look bad very quickly. One thing I do like about this is having that darker outer edge, and she has something similar going on, but something that I like to keep in my sketches and paintings regardless, just because it's something I think is nice, and I enjoy how it looks. Coming back with my pencil, let's get the black back again, and I'm going to shade in this upper area. One thing I like to do is when I'm shading in the top of the eye to make it darker than the rest, I like to add extra for where the pupil is, just to really show, because even though the pupil is right up against the surface of the eye, the reality is it's going to look as if it's concave. So if I go back to my pencil here and try to draw the shape of the eye, even though the eye is like that, it will look like this. This is how the eye will look. It will look as if you have this cave here, this cave in, and then that's where the pupil is going to be. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about that once we do the highlights, but I'm going to keep adding in more of a, let's see, where's the brush I was using? A shadow at the top here, and then add it as we move to the back. And then make sure this part of the eye is darker than the part over there, because that's where the light's coming from, since we see that the highlight is there. I'm going to revisit those eyelashes again. I see that they're actually coming over the surface of the eye a little bit. So I want to show that. And then here, I'm going to take my eraser and erase lightly, much lighter than that, just to show that this is the top of the eye and it's getting more light than the side of the eye. And then I'm going to do a few hints of eyelashes here. It's a little bit too dark, but I think the eyelashes are fine like that. So I'm going to make this brush smaller and do what I mentioned before, and make that corner darker, but not everywhere, just in this part where it's the thickest. And then I'm actually going to go ahead, another thing I like to do is just draw some lines around it. Draw those lines I mentioned again on top to add some variation to the eye. Like that. Draw a few more lines here to show folds in the skin, very lightly. I'm going to add some value here so I can show that highlight later. I'm going to go ahead and blend this area. Okay, so I'm going to add a little bit more value to this area here because it looks a lot darker. Sometimes this area will be lighter because the light will come down onto the top eyelid and then reflect back up into this part of the skin, but that's getting a little bit too complex, and it's not really going to happen too often in your sketches or paintings. So that looks better. So now I'm going to actually add some detail to the eyelash. I think I might cheat a little bit and use, it's not really cheating, but I'm saying it because I'm cheating because this is a tutorial, and I'm going to use this brush here to add, just to make this look a little bit more like hair before I use my own brush. Just a little bit of fidelity here. Use the hard skin brush to blend it a little less obvious. I don't like to spend too much time detailing the eyebrow, as you can tell. I like to focus on kind of what makes the eye the window to the soul, if you will. So the things that really influence that effect and how it affects the character, that's what I like to focus on. So the overall shape of the eyebrow and where it's pointing is usually the most important thing. Add some more strokes at the end here. Again, try to get some hairs outside of the edge so that they look more realistic, but don't just do this the whole way. You know, you got to be random and natural sometimes. Even though I said we're doing semi-realism where we avoid some irregularities, you want to keep some in there because that's what makes things look realistic. And now I think we can finally, not yet, I'm noticing there's quite a big shadow here, and I do like that, so I'm going to copy that and bring that in and darken this area a little bit just by adding some value loosely. We can blend it later. Just want to make sure I'm getting enough there to show what I want to show. I'm going to take my hard skin brush and blend that. You want to use a lot of varied strokes when you blend with Procreate. Take blending just as seriously as shading with a brush. And then now we can go into the fun part. So what we're going to do here is paint in the highlights. So highlights can be tricky. One big part is to notice that the eyelashes are causing shadows in the highlights. And so we're going to place the highlight in the same location. Actually use white. And so we're going to add. So depending on your style, you can go ahead and just do something like that. That can work depending. This has turned out to be a little bit more realistic, but even in things that aren't very realistic, you want to make the highlight look a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to just scribble in something there, and then I'm going to draw in some eyelashes reflecting, and then I'm going to blend some of this highlight away because the highlight isn't always perfectly sharp. It does blend at some edges. So if we zoom out, we can see that looks a lot more realistic. I'm going to add a little bit more white because the eyelashes look too regular. A little bit of that. And then I'm going to go ahead and add some highlight here. And then here, and then back corner of the eye. These are where kind of oil collects. And then some spots where I like to add it, not always, but I like to add some speckles up here. She actually has some on her eye. But I like to add some speckles and some random streaks of highlights. Of course, you need to come back and fill those areas in, but you don't have to, or you can just do this in a better order than I did. And then another thing I like to do is add some speckles here. She has those, and I like to add some water on the outer edge of the eyelid here. I'm losing all my vocabulary. And then add a little water line here. Feel free to play with that because sometimes it just looks fake. And then another thing I like to do is, if you notice, this area and this area is brighter than that corner. So I'm going to add a little bit of increase the value there. So I'm going to take my soft brush and sort of lighten the edges closest to the iris. I like to do this all the time as well. That's part of what makes a style a style. You'll see things that happen in real life and you'll like them and you'll just do them all the time. That's one thing that can influence a little bit of a style. So sometimes this happens, not all the time, but I like to always add it. So that's one way you can be able to tell if a drawing is by me. So you see that nice soft edge? That's really key to making eyes look realistic and cool. And the last thing I want to mention is you want to pay attention to how the light works inside of an eye. So since the highlight is here, the light is coming from the top corner and then coming down through the eye. And so remember, since we said this is kind of bending backwards like that, that is going to catch right inside that surface. And we can see that happening. That area of her eye is brighter than the top right. And so you would think, oh, the top right is closer to the light, it should be brighter. No, the light is coming past it and hitting this surface. So we want to add some highlight, very subtle, but some highlight inside the eye right there. And so that's really going to sell the realism that the light is coming through here, hits this top part of the eye, so there's a highlight, and then it starts reflecting back to our eyes down here. And as you can see, right here, we have our eye. And so I think this is, it can look, it's a lot more realistic than I planned, but I think it's great because it gives you a lot more information that you can play with when you're drawing your own eyes. And I'm not sure how long this video is, but I'm going to do a quick sketch of a stylized eye for you using my other reference and talk about it at the end so that you know what I did to make it more stylized. So as you can see, guys, I'm finally done with the stylized eye. I wish I made the eyebrow a little bit longer, but so the things that I decided to do with this one were to really elongate that shape and really accentuate the long, kind of sultry, thin eye look that the model had, and then also emphasize the differences in the type of eyelid. So she was of an Asian descent, and so her eyelids are very whatever the opposite of shallow is. They're very not shallow. The eyes are much closer to the surface of the face than they are in more of a European race dynamic or whatever. So I really emphasized that and made it even higher up. You'll see in a lot of characters in cartoons or online, the eyelid will be almost non-existent and it'll just be like this huge shade, and there won't really be any depth to where it tucks back in. Also, I emphasized a very specific number of eyelashes that you can kind of count. Normally you wouldn't be able to count the eyelashes, or else it would just be super painstaking. And also I just, I used a different color. I mixed up the colors and I made the highlight very simple. But I think if I were to finish this, it would still be a somewhat similar level of realism here, but because everything is stylized, it would be much more interesting and it would give off a lot more information about the character. Whereas this one, you can't tell too much about the character. It's more close to realism, and you would have to see a lot more about what the rest of their face is doing. So yeah, that's why I like to do something closer to this style a lot of the time. It's a lot more fun, and you have a lot more freedom when it comes to the development of the different parts. You don't really have to look at the reference too much. You just need to know the parts, and then you can move them around and tweak them as you please. So I hope this was a great tutorial. I hope it was different from all of the, I'm sure, hundreds of eye tutorials that exist out there, and I hope you learned something. If you go through this tutorial, make sure to tag me on Instagram. I love seeing you guys when you follow my tutorials, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.